again. It is me, Margaret Maczewska, a doctor from Poland who is making videos that not many people view except for my mom. Cześć, mama. But maybe someone else will also. Maybe they're really bored because they're in quarantine and you just find really strange things online. So, I'm a doctor in Warsaw, Poland, and I'm in Poland. So maybe you don't know what is Poland, where is Poland, and Google doesn't help you. So this is Poland, Poland, not to be confused with Holland, which sounds a little bit similar. Both are in Europe, except Holland is more west, and it is in a very wet place. There's a lot of ports there and canals and ships, and it used to be a very wealthy country with diamonds and tulips and colonies, and it had things like artwork and Van Gogh. And yes, so that is Holland, and they have windmills. And Poland, well, you probably don't know much about Poland, but Poland is amongst other Slavic countries where like pierogi come from, sausage, Polish sausage, kiełbasa. Maybe it rings a bell. We are often made fun of in the US for some strange reason, which actually seems quite to the contrary when it comes to IQs, in my opinion. But, it's hard to break stereotypes. So, yeah, so Poland is in Central Europe, technically, but for many considered East Europe, possibly due to the Soviet bloc and, Berlin Wall, things like that. I don't know if you know. So I have decided to share with you some bits about Polish history so you know more about this country that is somewhere where people think polar bears are. They're not here. Unfortunately, they look cuddly and nice. They are more Russia, like Siberia places, and then, Alaska and Canada and somewhere there. So yes, we are on a plane, in the central plain in Europe, which means we are flat. We have the Baltic Sea on the north, and then we have the mountains, Tatra Mountains, in the south. But basically, we are flat, so this makes it very easy for different people to invade us. And that in short is the history of Poland. People invading us, and maybe us trying to invade them, but that doesn't really work. So officially, people say the history of Poland started in 966 when Mieszko I was the king of Poland, was crowned, was baptized. And so, there were like these tribes of like Slavic people here. And so Mieszko became a Christian. He was baptized into Catholicism, and that is when people say the history of Poland began. So then there were like kings, trying to make their kingdom bigger, and then they were fighting amongst each other, or their sons were fighting. Then there was this guy called Kazimierz the Great, and he was actually quite a good king and would build up civilization here and strengthen forts. And he was also good because he brought people into Poland to help him. So he invited Jews to help, and he invited people from Holland. They're called Dutch because there were like marshlands, and he wanted them to make them not so marshy. And yes, so then there were also Germans, because the Germans had cities. So the Germans were helping build cities in Poland, and yes. Then a little bit later, the one dynasty was finishing, and there was a daughter. Her name was Jadwiga, and she was young. And so basically, if there were no male heirs, and so they were trying to force her to marry someone, and for the sake of continuing the dynasty. And so she ended up marrying an older man whose name was Jagiełło, last name was not Jagiełło. And this united Poland and Lithuania because he was the prince of Lithuania. So yes, then she didn't live very long, this Queen Jadwiga. In English, Jadwiga is Hedwig. It doesn't really sound that nice. And but then she gave her jewelry, and this began the university in Krakow called Jagiellonian University, because that was her last name after her husband. Yes, so that was Queen. Well, she was King Jadwiga for a while until, she was a woman who was king. Then there were more, like, there were some nice kings, and then not so nice ones, and they would fight, like Jan III Sobieski. He had these like cavalry with the soldiers having these wings, and when they would ride their horses, they would make this sound that was scary. And at that time, people from Turkey were attacking Vienna, and he helped stop this. This was sometime in the 17th century. And then in the 18th century, we had this king who was very cultured. You know, he had a lot of artist friends, like painters, architects. They would read things and discuss poetry. But at that time, our neighbors were becoming very strong military-wise. And, you know, he was building lovely things and commissioning paintings. And, you know, he was under the... He really was a fan of Catherine the Great, who was a ruler of Russia. And this wasn't a good thing because at some point, Russia, Prussia, and Austria just divided up Poland. They just, you know, partitioned it. They took one part, like divided into three. So they did that 3 times in the 18th century, and then finally there was no Poland because it disappeared off the face of the map. So that was interesting, and so the people that lived there still spoke Polish. With time, that became sort of illegal. Like there were problems with speaking Polish in schools, like in the territories ruled by Prussia. So there was like opposition. Then there were people trying to keep up Polish culture. For example, there was this painter, Jan Matejko. He would paint paintings of battles in the past. For example, in 1410, the battle of in Grunwald, to help people know their identity, that our history united us, our language united us. So this was actually a time when there was a lot of things going on in Polish culture, but for 123 years we were not a nation. So we were like an ethnic group without a nation. You know, there are many such instances in the world, like, you know, diaspora of different ethnicities. And then World War I happened, and so actually all of the people who were occupying or had partitioned Poland were fighting amongst each other. So this was a great opportunity to actually like get rid of them. But unfortunately, like, people in Poland had to fight against each other because, you know, some were with the Prussian army, some were with the Russian army. But as a result of World War I and supported by people like Woodrow Wilson, Poland regained its independence, or like forced independence, on November 11th, 1918. This was after 123 years of not being a nation. So we were this sort of country that was on really different paths, because the parts that were ruled by Russia were much more poor. There was basically just farmland there. Education-wise, it was also more, you might say, backward. Then the parts that were ruled by Prussia were much more forward, educated. Yes, Austria-Hungary as well. So it took them a while to sort of unite the different parts of Poland and to get people to rebuild the government in Warsaw. It was a pretty turbulent time. This was in the 1920s. There were like assassinations of politicians because, but it started to go in the right direction. We started to like build a military and like a navy, things like that, and to start schooling people, blah blah blah. But then fascism became popular, authoritarian regimes became popular. So in our east, Russia went into a revolution, the communist revolution. At one point, they wanted to attack Poland and bring it to Europe. That was in 1920, but luckily we managed to stop them. And then to our west, our German neighbors unfortunately voted in this Adolf guy. And so a lot of these like criminal elements supported him, and then they became non-criminal elements because they became the ruling party. This was in the 1930s, obviously. A lot of this hate speech everywhere, and scapegoats. Some of those elements also occurred in Poland, unfortunately. So in September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany attacked Poland, of course, saying that we attacked first. And our military was retreating eastward to regroup. But then Stalin and Soviet Russia attacked us on September 17th, 1939. So basically, the retreating army was captured by the Soviets. Still, we put up a fight for a while, like Warsaw fought for a while. Then we were occupied, and probably the history of World War II very well. So there were a lot of rules, and that served to dehumanize people, segregate people, work them to death, starve them to death, or actually kill them. The Polish officers that were in Russian hands were massively shot in Katyń. Some managed to escape. The Polish government in exile formed Romania, then in France, then in the UK, and it was officially part of the Allies until the Russians changed, and from being an ally of Nazi Germany to being their enemy. And when they became friends with the Allies, they belittled the input of Poland. And so after the war, we were sold into Russian hands. So Poland became communist, even though actually the population was not really of that political mindset. And so this lasted basically from 1944-45 until 1989, because being communist or being forced into communism, there were a lot of these like uprisings and like trying to overthrow, well, maybe like workers being unhappy with not having food and blah blah blah. And then with time it became not only not having food but also not having freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And that was the Solidarity Trade Union that manifested in the late 1970s, 80s. Then, of course, our own Generał Jaruzelski instituted martial law in 1981. Basically, tanks rolled out onto the streets to like squash this uprising or whatever it wasn't. Yeah, and so then everyone was put into jails. People going to church were being beat up by the militia, which is like the police, except they like hit you. And then there were people being like murdered, and this was Poles murdering Poles. But then with time in 1989 we had the first semi-free elections, and that was, at least on paper, the end of communism. And yes, so in the past 30 years, like, we are technically a free nation. There are still a lot of strange things happening. Some of the laws from communism are still like on the books, very bizarre things like that judges don't pay taxes, very strange. And people who were in the militia murdering others would have really high like pensions when they went they retired. very strange things like that. And compared to like people who were fighting the Nazis in 1944, basically having like starving pensions. So yes, and now we're in 2020, where our political situation is a mess. Our society is divided because some are more left, some are more right, and they can't really get along. And the politicians just want money, basic things that you know from your own experience. So I guess that's basically it. Yeah, I mean, there were some great figures in that I should have mentioned, like Copernicus, he's from Toruń, he's Polish. Maria Skłodowska-Curie, she's from Warsaw. She was from Warsaw. She just went to the Sorbonne to study because she couldn't study here. And she married this Pierre guy and, found a few radioactive elements. She had a fairly tough life because, women obviously are not as intelligent. Yes, the only man who saw her intelligence was this guy named Albert Einstein. He thought she was a smart lady. But the other smart guys, they obviously. And then more recently, we have Karol Wojtyła, who was a priest, then became a bishop, and then became Pope John Paul II. Then there was Lech Wałęsa. He was the guy who was the electrician who was leading the Solidarity Union in Gdańsk. I guess that's about it, So that's Poland. Poland, not Holland. In a nutshell, more or less. Historians will probably kill me because I left out a lot of information that was probably very crucial. But yeah, so that's something. So if you're interested more in this subject, there's a British historian, Norman Davies, who really likes the Polish people. He also had like Polish wives, or like his wives were Polish. And so he wrote some things like God's Playground, I believe. Okay, that's it. Bye.